I had no background in business or markets. I didn't even know what a share was. It's difficult to train freshers, but better than unlearning bad habits. But I only hired freshers.
Should Indian investors invest globally?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, that's, I think, the biggest gap in for Indian investors, that they have 100% of their investments in India. Objectively, the number should be higher, but at least get to 30-40% of your portfolio. And global doesn't mean the US. And because it's a cause for me, we have all geographies, all asset product that starts at $10,000. So less than 9 lakh rupees currently.
One thing about Mr. Rakesh Jhunjhunwala sir that ordinary investors today should follow or should look up to.
So he knew that the market returns are lumpy. He said, I made a lot of money in 89 to 92. And he said, in between, there were even 5 years when I made no money. So to understand that in equity markets, 10-year returns can come in 2 years, and every 5 years the returns can be completely different. That discipline is the key learning.
Interesting, because like when you said something like,
I mean, he did not know he would make all his money in CRISIL, Titan and Lupin. That was Rakesh's superpower, to know कि in equity market there could be 5 years when you get no return, and then you will make out like a bandit. Amazon, Apple, Tesla, all these have come close to bankruptcy multiple times.
Hi Devina ma'am. First of all, thanks a lot for coming on this podcast. It's been a great pleasure for me to actually have you on this podcast as well. So quickly, when we begin, I just want to understand your journey into the markets and how you've come to this point from Citibank to First Global, and how you've reached this point as a PMS fund manager as well.
Okay, so the actual journey started in Lucknow, long way from the markets.
Oh, wow.
So when I went to IIM, I had no background in business or markets. I didn't even know what a share was.
Wow.
So because Lucknow back then, and maybe to an extent even now, is not a business city at all. And my parents were both academics. They had no interest in money or investing. So after the MBA also, again, you have no background. So at that time, Citibank was a very coveted job. I got it. In fact, I didn't even interview elsewhere. So in Citi, I was in investment banking, what was then called merchant banking.
Merchant bank.
And then in the corporate bank. And I was looking for a change, because I realized that this was not the kind of life I wanted. It was, and I explored many options. And then in around 1992, there were two developments. One was Dr. Manmohan Singh's budget,
Yes.
which opened the market to foreign institutional investors. So till then, foreigners could not invest in India. So that was one change. And I said, now the market will professionalize, because till then there was nothing called equity research in India. So much so that at IIM Ahmedabad, we had no course on equity research, because that career didn't exist in India. So that was one. The other was, at that time, SEBI didn't exist, NSE did not exist. So there were all these regional stock exchanges all over the country. And the biggest was Bombay Stock Exchange, of course. So Bombay Stock Exchange advertised that they would give 71 new memberships to professionals.
Wow.
At a cost of 55 lakhs, which of course was a huge amount.
55 lakhs.
But it was a quarter of the market price, because the market price of a BSE membership, or BSE card as it was called, was 2 crores. So people said, don't even apply. I said, because as I said, there was no regulator. BSE was a broker's club, and it was 80% Gujarati, 20% Marwadi. They said, you're not even from the right community. You're a woman on top of that. And I know people who didn't even apply. They said, milna hai hi nahi. They apne bhai bhatijo ko denge. Why will they give to outsiders at a quarter of the market price? I said, let me apply. So let us see. So they took 2 years over the whole process. And of course, they tried their hardest not to give it, in the sense whatever was the subjective part, they tried. But in the end, I got 2 extra marks for my IMA gold medal. And that pushed me over the cutoff. So you don't know, in hindsight, where the dots will connect. And I said, this list mein top nahi karna hai. I just need to be on that list. So I think in that 71, I was number 69. But I got the BSE card. And at that time, it was like, BSE card, if you get, your life is made. So, and then I started on the institutional broking and some amount of investment banking, what is now called QIP. So that was the business in the 90s. And I mean, how long back it was that BSE, or for that matter, any stock exchange, did not even allow corporate memberships, because it was that the broker should have unlimited liability. So only proprietorships and partnerships were allowed. So this was a proprietorship. So in the early reports, like for example, HDFC Bank in 1996, if you see at the bottom, is member Messrs. Devina Mehra, because the corporate membership had not yet come. Then, of course, NSE came, corporate membership came. So the name became First Global. I mean, we were already using First Global, but the memberships also moved to First Global. And the 90s was institutional broking almost entirely with foreign institutions. And then that became very large in that purely on the basis of our research. I always tell people who join that we've never taken outside capital and the business has entirely been built on intellectual capital. And when I started this, I thought because along with the foreign institutions, the foreign brokers also came. And I said, I have not even studied securities research. These guys have been doing it for 50, 70 years. Let me learn from what they do. But I looked at the first few reports and I said, this is junk. This is not good quality analysis. This is not written well. After that, I never looked at competition. I said, I have to learn this from first principles. I never hired from competition as far as research is concerned. The sales, etc. is different. But I only hired freshers. In fact, almost nobody else hired freshers. I hired only freshers. I said, it's difficult to train freshers, but better than unlearning bad habits. So I mean, now alumni are all over the industry, buy side, sell side. So Teachers Day, Guru Purnima, I get all these messages. That you taught us. So that was the 90s. So we became very large in that. QIPs again. This is my pet bugbear is the amount of mis-selling in financial services. So while we did investment banking, I was always very clear that I would pick and choose and do only what makes sense for the investor, what will make money for the issues that will make money for the investor.
Yeah.
So, and then towards the end of the 90s, we did something which nobody had dreamt of, which was going global.
Yeah.
So that was one trigger was the Asian crisis, which is now for most of your viewers is there only in the history books.
Yeah, we need to learn that also.
Yeah, so they lived through that, and these were the Asian tigers, the high growth economies of the 90s. And then they had this crisis where in 1 year, just in 1 year, between the currency and the markets, in dollar terms, those markets fell between 50% and 90%. So 50% for Taiwan, 90% for Indonesia, and South Korea, Philippines, Thailand, all were between this 50 and 90. And I said, this, if you were in one of those markets, this much of your net worth could be wiped out. And in Citibank, I had spent 6 months in Indonesia. So, it was close home. I said, Dad, if today I was in Indonesia, 90% of my net worth would be wiped out in a year. So this is the danger of being in one market.
Yeah.
And so that was one. The other was simply that, for me, the big thrill in life is learning. In this business, the input and output is money, but the big thrill for me is learning. So that kab tak wahi stocks karte rahenge. Enough time I've spent doing the same HDFC, and by that time Infosys was also around, and Bajaj Auto and all that. So let me think. So my clients were these large, very, very large institutions in the world. And by that time, they are all your friends, not just the India fund manager. Everybody is a friend through the hierarchy. So I asked some of the very senior people in fund management that I want to go global. So they said, add one of the Asian countries, then the emerging market fund manager can give you some business there. I said, what's the point of adding a Philippines or a Thailand? I want to go to the big market. I said, don't be silly. Who's going to listen to you? You are a nobody. They have all these Merrills and Morgans and Goldman Sachs and Citicorps to listen to. Why would they listen to you? And so there's no point. And if you go there, do the small stocks. And I said, no, I want to go to the big markets and do the big stocks. Because if I know how to do securities analysis, I should be able to do it. That's my bet.
Correct.
And so against all advice, at that time, there was never any idea anybody had of offshoring research or outsource. So I said, you can join the analyst call from anywhere. Now, how is it? But that was, as I said, nobody had ever thought of that. So in 1999, we became not just the first Indian, we became the first Asian members of the London Stock Exchange, other than the Japanese. And then the next year of the NASD, the US Broker-Dealer Association. And the most heartening thing in all of this was that here you also know the journalists and the editors. There you knew nobody. So in a sense, it was only your work going out. And in no time, we were in Forbes, Fortune, Business Week, Business, Wall Street Journal, front page, Barron's. So that was a big endorsement that if you
Wow.
do quality work, it gets recognized.
Yeah.
Because, it's a passion for us to just go in depth and understand and not just do it at the surface level, which is where, most people stop.
Yeah.
I mean, I used to tell my analysts that unless you can show me the derivation of a formula, don't use that formula, because then you don't understand what that formula is doing. If you're using a model, if you cannot tell me the limitations and assumptions, don't use it, because then you are building an edifice, you don't know what's in the foundation. So that was the kind of the first big addition or pivot or whatever. And then beyond a point, for 20 years we were on what's called the sell side, the broking and the investment banking side. But beyond a point, it gets frustrating because you are trying to convince fund managers to do something which they may or may not do. I mean, a good example being around 2008-9, you're going around telling people that this whole infrastructure company boom is coming to an end, and look at how the return ratios are declining and all that. But at that time, nobody listened. So also, I mean, telecom, you did this thing looking at all the international telecom companies, how the trajectory goes, how beyond a point, the subscriber addition starts to taper off. Because you see, this is a finite subscriber business.
Yeah.
Now, it cannot grow forever, and therefore the PEs start to shrink, but then no one listens to you. So then the asset management was the next step. So you'd be surprised, we started the global asset management first in 2015, and then in 2020 started the PMS. I mean, I'd had a license for 20 years, but I said, till I have a system where there's some consistency and predictability, I can't take people's money. It's a big responsibility to take people's money. So we started the PMS in 2020.
Wow. Ma'am, from what I can hear, I mean, this is just experience that you have, right? From so many years. And you've seen 1990s, the 2000s and 2008. Now, most of the audience who are here have definitely not experienced or seen it. The max that we've experienced maybe would be COVID drop, which was a few days and then...
Which also a lot of people have come after COVID. I mean, the
Exactly.
number of demat accounts have gone up so much after COVID.
No, and COVID never hit so hard
Because it was a very short...
Yeah, it was just a knee-jerk reaction kind of a thing, right? But I want to understand from you, whether it was 1992, 2000 or 2008, you've lived through all three, right? How did it feel at that point, the markets? I know it was every phase had a different situation.
I think the biggest hit was 2000.
2000 was the biggest hit?
Yeah, because globally, I mean, the tech crash was really, I mean, it decimated so many companies. And remember, the Nasdaq did not clear its 2000 high decisively till 2015. It took 15 years to come back to that level. So everything else was much shorter compared to that. Of course, that was the global part. And which also people forget. People think that whatever happens in the US is what happens around the world. But if you look at the data in that time frame, so for India, from 1994 to 2003, the Sensex gave zero net return. It went up and it went down. 9 years, the return was zero. And then from 2003 to 2007, it went up about 6 times.
Okay.
And
Wow.
that was a period when US underperformed hugely. So that is when, so narratives always follow what's happening in the market. So during the time, so US was already kind of down in the dumps after the tech crash. And yet in those 4.5, 5 years, it gave only about 60% return. So as I said, the Nasdaq didn't even come close to its high. Whereas at that time, the emerging market index itself went up, I think, 4.5 times. India went up 6 times. Brazil went up 10 times. So that's when the narrative came that now US is over and now it is the century of the BRICS was coined at that time.
Oh, wow.
And then once the US started outperforming again, that whole story was forgotten. So always remember the narratives follow. And with exactly the same situation, you can justify a market rise and a market fall. So that was a period when emerging markets did very well. But as I said, there was a 9-year period before that where the net displacement was zero. And actually there was about a 40%, I think, or 35% crash from the top in that period. So it went up and then it came down.
Yeah.
So that was, in
was in 2000.
India, that was also a long period of ups and downs.
Yeah. And if you draw parallels today, because there is a lot of talk in the US market about this AI spending circle and AI in a bubble. And then we see Warren Buffett going in cash and then people draw 15 parallels on that as well. Do you see some parallels being drawn from 2000 to 2000 now in 2025, 26? Or do you think it's nothing, it's a normal course of growth?
No, AI, AI, there's always a fascination with new technologies.
Yes.
And I always tell people that that's a risky area always to invest because you don't know which technology will succeed, how long it will take to succeed, even if it succeeds, which companies will succeed, and whether investors will make money in that. So, I mean, at all levels. For example, people think electric vehicles is something new. The first electric car in India was launched, I think, 24 years ago, Reva.
Reva. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I used to meet renewable energy companies in the 90s in Hyderabad and Chennai and all that. So this is all, and also whether you will make return on capital, that's the main thing. So if you look at, go back to the internet era, there was this, that everybody in the world will use the internet and therefore people who are putting up the infrastructure, you bet on them because, everybody has to use the infrastructure, even if you're not betting on the end companies. So one of the companies which laid these undersea cables was called Global Crossing. So they laid a lot of the undersea cables on which the internet still runs.
Today,
the internet still runs, but the company went bankrupt 20 plus years ago. So whether you will make a return on capital, if you look at the whole 20th century, which are the two technologies that transformed how humanity lives, automobiles and aviation.
Yeah.
And both have been a graveyard of companies. They've been they have not made money for investors. So that is the way it is in new technologies. There was this guy who used to write a technology column in one of the international magazines, and in his farewell column, after writing it for 45 years, he listed so many technologies that were launched with so much fanfare. Google Glass and 3D television, and look at Facebook changed its name to Meta because of Metaverse, and now what's happened to Metaverse?
There's no Metaverse anymore.
So this is the risk of new technologies. I looked at some of these data on the LLMs. The usage dropped 60% in the school college vacations. So it's being used by the students. So are they going to pay? I mean, that's the whole point. Something might be used, but is it going to make return on capital? And look at the investment that's going into it. You look at all the people, or the Googles and Metas and whoever wants to be in the AI race. They're hiring people or taking over 1-2% companies at 100 million, at 500 million. I mean, that kind of salaries. I mean, it is crazy. And then you're putting up these huge data centers. And what are data centers? A lot of real estate, a lot of very fast depreciating equipment. In fact, there's talk that they are not depreciating it quickly enough. And then
the chip depreciation of 3 years to 10 years.
And then a lot of energy usage. Whether, as I said, whether all of these will make anything close to economic returns. And yet, if you want to be in the race, you have to spend on all this.
You have to do it.
So that's the whole point. So that's and also there's a lot of debt being raised by the AI companies, which sounds even crazier to me. I mean, equity bet, still one can understand to an extent, but to give debt to this kind of model is extremely
I think many
risky.
Companies are bleeding their free cash flow status now and going into aggressive capex.
And that's, I'm talking about the big, that you're talking the bigger companies. But the smaller companies or companies which are not yet generating cash and profits are even still raising debt. And somebody is, giving debt to them. So that's a crazy cycle. And that cannot end very well, I mean, to my mind. That's even I was looking at the data for the US that not only has technology driven the entire index, within that companies that are not making profits have risen even faster.
Wow. Understood. And ma'am, in the Indian context or even the international context, you have seen many companies that have become like multi-baggers, right? 10x, 20x, 100x even. And as you mentioned some few examples that you had seen HDFC grow at that point and Bajaj. Have you identified something that is, let's say, common between great companies or companies that become great? Because future, if you'd ask me today, I don't know what's going to become great. But I'm sure you know some traits today that you've seen in the past, that these are some good characteristics of great companies. I mean, you've been in the space for so long.
So actually, people ask me that you identified HDFC Bank in 1996 and Amazon in 2001. when the entire Wall Street was against it. So tell me the new HDFC Bank or Amazon, and I will buy it from my baby.
Yeah, we
and,
never know, but I'm
for
sure you know
25.
some traits of
No,
common
but then
traits.
anybody who tells you they have this magic wand is lying.
Of
I mean,
course.
because nobody in the world, no fund manager, no investor has ever had a portfolio which consists even 50% of multi-baggers, let
course.
alone 100%. So
Yeah.
nobody. I mean, Warren Buffett sells 85% of what he buys within 2 years.
We have seen
50,
that.
50% within 6 months. So nobody knows, because life and markets are a game of probability. They are a game of luck and skill. So it is not 100% skill. So don't fool yourself that you are a genius or no. So no one has visibility. At the most, you can say that I think this stock will double or triple. I mean, even Aditya Puri wouldn't have known the trajectory of HDFC Bank, or Jeff Bezos wouldn't have known that about
Right.
Amazon. And every company goes through a lot of ups and downs. If you read the books on Amazon, let us say, or Titan, which was Rakesh Jhunjhunwala's big winner, there's so many ups and downs. I mean, companies have gone, all these, Amazon, Apple, Tesla, all these have come close to bankruptcy multiple times. So it was lucky that you lived through it and had a great trajectory, but no one knows this in advance. So the only way to get multi-baggers really is that you buy 25, 30 stocks, and that too with some system and properly. Even then, you can rest assured at least 5, 7, 8 will do nothing like what you thought they would. I mean,
Yeah.
they'd be turned out to be duds. You have to get out of them.
Yeah.
The rest might give you normal returns, and if you are lucky and if you've chosen well, maybe 2 or 3 will become multi-baggers. So that's the kind of ratio you have to work with. So no one knows in advance. And I was laughing a bit on that. You asking which companies are great. So if you look at all these, in search of excellence,
Yeah.
good to great, all these companies which were identified in these books.
Yeah.
And then you look at their trajectory in the 10, 20 years thereafter. Not only have on the average all of them underperformed the index, business-wise also they have had dips thereafter.
Wow.
So that's after like all that research, this is what comes out.
Yeah.
So beyond a point, this is so you have to be humble about it. You have to know that you're working with probabilities.
Yeah.
And sometimes aapka matlab, you will have an unexpected sixer. I mean, something which might be in hindsight a wrong decision-making process might give you something which makes you a lot of return. But then be very clear that what was luck and what was skill.
Photo skill. Very interesting. Very interesting. And ma'am, what investment framework do you use today? Right? Has it evolved over time? How do you plan your portfolio when you have to find something?
So yes, of course, it has evolved over time. So in the 90s, we went deeper and deeper into fundamentals. So particularly cash flows and return on capital, return on equity, things which people didn't focus on that much at that time. So I mean, everyone remembers our positive call on HDFC Bank, but we actually had a negative call. We were by far the only firm to have a negative call on HDFC, the parent.
Oh, wow.
And at that time, it was the number one favorite stock of the FII. So at that time, because the FII limit started out low and then they used to increase it after like a year or something. So every time that limit opened, HDFC was sold out on the first day. The limit up, or limit complete FII limit exhausted. So people used to, when we wrote a negative report, people said, are you crazy? That's the most loved stock in the universe in India. So how can it underperform? And I said like, no, I mean, the fundamentals tell you something, because they had been raising money. I mean, nothing wrong with the management of the business, but they'd been raising money too frequently and the returns were getting diluted. And so ultimately it had a time correction for 5 years. The price remained where it was.
Wow.
So that's the whole point. So we kept refining a lot of that. In terms of looking at technicals or momentum, we started that in the early 2000s because we realized that, sometimes you're missing part of the move, that you think this is a good buy, but it falls a little more before going up. But having refined those systems for a very long time, I also know that, you cannot go by any kind of technical system as an overall signal. That is too noisy. It can only be used to refine your entry or exit in something you have identified elsewhere.
Okay.
Now what we use is what we call a human plus machine system. So we use a variety of systems. Like one of them is a bottom-up system, which is which looks at a lot of fundamental parameters. It has tested parameters and seen what works, what doesn't work. So let us say for a PMS, we look at stocks over 1,000 crore market cap. So that's roughly about 750, 800 stocks. And so this will rank those stocks from 1 to 800 or 1 to 750. And the plus with this system is that you are without bias and without randomness, you are looking at all these stocks. Otherwise, as human beings, you will, while you might say you are looking at, let us say, even 15, 20 parameters, actually the human mind cannot fathom these many things together. And also remember, no company is going to be great on all 15, 20 or bad on all 15, 20. So how do you combine the factors and how do you then rank the company? So those are the things the system does. And as I said, it does it without bias and without randomness. And these are two things which I have understood really by reading Daniel Kahneman's books. And he clearly says that even a relatively simplified system will always outperform a human being because bias, of course, is systematic, like we have loss aversion or we have this halo effect, and we have many, many biases which are very hard coded in human evolution. But there's also randomness that if I have 10 fund managers with 20 years of experience and I give them exactly the same data on the company, all of them will have different opinions.
Correct.
Even the same person will have a different opinion. For example, they've found that if you want relief from a judge, like a bail or something, you're more likely to get rejected before lunch and accepted after lunch.
Oh, wow.
So this is how random human beings are. So the machine or the artificial intelligence system eliminates that. So we're not using artificial intelligence because it is fashionable or because it is available. It really genuinely solves a problem, and that part has become very critical because the skill set required in the markets has changed. So when I started out, as I said, in 93, there was nothing called securities research. No company had an investor relations person also. Nobody, half the people didn't even, half the companies didn't want to meet you. They said, why should we meet you? From there, we have come here. So in the 90s, the edge was an information edge. Yesterday, I met one CEO and I was telling him that I came to your plant back then, and this is like in a remote part of UP. So I love going to plants. I've seen so many factories and plants. But at that time, as I said, the edge was an information edge. Even getting the annual report of a company was not simple.
That was also an edge.
That was also an edge at times, for obscure companies. But from there, now the information is available everywhere. And
Correct.
also by law, information has to be available to everyone. I mean, earlier it was analyst meet was a closed door meet.
Correct.
Now the analyst meet transcript has to be on the website. And this information arbitrage was there everywhere. I mean, US also it was the same, that a fund manager could meet a company and get differential information. Now, everywhere it's been regulated away. So now the skill set has moved from getting information to analyzing data and information.
Processing and analyzing.
And that is where the machines have an edge, because human beings cannot handle masses of data the same way machines can. And as I said, without bias, without also, for example, human beings hate admitting mistakes. A machine has no problem for them. Success and failure is the same, both to be learned from.
Binary.
So, So, I mean, for them, it doesn't matter.
Yeah.
So
what's an edge according to you today? Is it the processing and speed of...
Yeah, it has to be. The analogy I give is hockey. So, I mean, since many of your viewers will be young, it's a quiz question for them that why is hockey India's national game when we did nothing in hockey for the last 50 years?
Yeah.
And the answer to that is that India and later on India and Pakistan dominated hockey from 1928 Olympics up to the mid-70s. So much so that there were 2 Olympics when not a single goal was scored against India. We were that good. And but then what happened in the 1970s? Literally the playing field changed.
Yeah.
They changed from natural grass to artificial AstroTurf. And the skill set required changed.
Oh my God.
And Indians were very good at this stick work and all that, all the legendary Major Dhyan Chands, that kind of level. And then on artificial grass, the skill set changed. It became how fast you are, how fit you are, where Indians were not that good. And so you could no longer win. So even now, most of the fund management industry is still managing funds the way they were doing in the 90s. And that is why outperformance is so difficult for them, because now the playing field has changed, and unless you change your skill set, you cannot win.
Yeah.
It's the same with tennis, for example. I mean, from wooden rackets to metal titanium now. Bon Bog, who still is the joint holder of the longest number of Wimbledon win, most number of Wimbledon win, he tried to make a comeback with his old wooden racket. A few years later, he couldn't go past the first round.
Wow.
That is how
Things have been changing.
Yeah, brutal changes are.
Wow. So that clearly is an edge right now. I think analyzing, because I also feel today there's too much noise. Even I analyze some companies, but I feel there's too much for me to analyze today because, as you said, everyone's giving con calls. There's so many PPTs out there. Even if you specialize, the market is changing so fast. So processing and analyzing information, as you said, I think we were talking just before this, that good information has to go in and good information. You can't put garbage in, garbage out, right?
Yeah, so I mean, see, artificial intelligence again has become a catchword.
Yeah.
People think that saying we have quant methods or we are using artificial intelligence is makes you cutting edge. And the analogy I give is that suppose I ask you that how good are financial models made on Excel? You will say that's an absurd question. Excel is a tool, depends on what you're putting in the model.
Correct.
I said AI is also only a tool. It depends on what you're putting in, how good your models are, how good your data is.
It's not a magic black box or something.
It is just a tool. What are you
Yeah.
doing with it? And which is why pure quant guys also do not do a good job of making these models, because you also need the market expertise.
Yeah.
And there are some very simple things that you do not. Now the computing power is available, so you can literally test thousands of factors, or you can just run tests. And in life there are spurious correlations. So you will if you run millions of runs,
Yeah.
you will find some factors which ostensibly work very well. In life, you can plot, let us say, a curve of nuclear energy versus cheese consumed, and it might be a correlation of 1.
Yeah.
So something similar can happen here also, that something can look very highly correlated when there is no causality. So that is why you have to, one of the sort of steps we make sure is that we first identify the factors. Basically, you have a hypothesis that will this factor work, and then you test it.
Yeah. Interesting.
Not just randomly test x squared plus y cubed square root of z and to the power so much, nothing like that.
Yeah.
So that's the whole point, that this is only one of the steps.
Yeah.
Data cleaning takes half the time, literally. It takes 50-60% of the time to ensure that the
Yeah.
data is fine. It is survivorship bias free. That's another thing, many steps like that. So as I said, just copying the AI kind of buzzword is easy, but
yeah.
Doing the rigor of the actual system is not so easy.
That happened with quant also in India, right? Sometime just a few years ago, we had a lot of quant firms popping up. But now if I compare them to, let's say, US quant firms who are sitting on a very different game, right? Do you think that is also something that we're seeing right now? Or do we see quant actually truly evolving like how the quant firms in US are there?
As I said, not many people are willing to do the hard work. So when we have gone into the details of our system with, let us say, the tech entrepreneur kind of investor, or people who have knowledge, many of them tell us that, let alone in India, we've not seen anybody in the US also do this kind of work.
Interesting.
But this is not, just to clarify, these are not trading algos. That's not what we are doing. So this is very much looking at mostly fundamental, little bit of momentum data, and then running this, most of the time, like this thing we run once a quarter.
Okay.
So,
Okay. So, ma'am, now I want to ask you about your wins in the past, right? Somewhere that you used your framework and you got a good win that you were really happy with. So, just as an example, I want to understand how you saw it. Obviously, you don't know in the future it'll be a win. We spoke about that. But what are some key checklists that you saw from an analyzing framework?
So as I said, the two which people remember the most are HDFC Bank on Amazon.
Yeah.
And see, when HDFC Bank, so this was 1 year after its IPO, and what we had on the cover of that report was, we had a baby saying this is what it is now, and we had Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the reigning Mr. Universe, that this is what it will be.
Oh.
And so there, of course, see,
Nice.
there was also the fundamental thing, because till then, the market was very skewed towards PSU banks. They were more or less 100% of the market. So it's like good, well-run private sector bank with a good pedigree comes in, it has a good chance. then remember HDFC Bank was not a retail bank back then, it was a corporate bank, and I had been a corporate banker. So I knew how difficult it is to get into the good corporate consortiums. There they had a kind of an unfair advantage, which was the brand name and the connections of HDFC, and that really got them in places. But I say that was not a pure numbers call, it was a plus call, because Aditya Puri downwards, all the people, I mean, most key people in HDFC Bank were from Citibank. So they were ex-colleagues. So I knew them. So I knew the capabilities. And for example, their risk head was my last boss in Citi, and I knew he was a conservative guy. So I am a very nervous investor in banks. So I said, if he's in charge, at least I'm sure they're not going to make too many, senseless bets. So, and Amazon was a pure numbers call. Amazon, surprisingly, when we made this big strong buy call, which was at a price of $15, which split adjusted is 75 cents, in 2001, this is after the crash, every other Wall Street firm was negative on the company. That week, Business Week had a cover story, is Amazon going bust? And I mean, to me, it was really absurd, because that was the first time they were out of that danger of going bust. That in the last quarter of 2000, they had made something like 220 or 240 million of cash flows. And we confirmed them that with them. We said, we don't want forward-looking statement, but just confirm that, the calculation is correct and you made this kind of cash. They said, yes. So we said, then it's a no-brainer at this price. And we had a strong buy. Nobody else even had a buy. So Jeff Bezos actually wrote us an email saying, thanks for the support.
Oh my God.
Because we were in the minority of one. But so that was mostly, I would say the cash flow returns, those were the things that we focus on. Besides, of course, growth you have to see. But most people stop at the income statement level. You should not stop at the income statement level. And companies also know that most people stop at the income statement level. Every result, how do you analyze this was a sales growth, this happened to margin, this happened to profit. So they also know it. So when there's problem in a company, they will first try to protect the income statement. So for example, if you're not able to sell, you will tell your buyer or intermediary that, take the material, instead of in 30 days, you pay in 90 days. So your receivables will start to get stretched.
Correct.
So often the strain first shows in the ratios like receivables, payables, and the cash flows.
Correct.
So those things you have to look at. So, but over a period of time also, as I said, that as a human being, you can look at only so many parameters. And also, as I said, no company is great on everything or bad on everything. So that's where the machines help you actually analyze everything on the same basis. And the other thing is that human beings are creatures of the story. So once we have bought into a story, it is very difficult for us to change our mind.
Interesting.
So the machine forces you to look at that.
Yeah.
So I'll give you an example from the time we started using the machine. So in 2020, the big sector which everybody loved, there was all this story of buy the consumer brands with predictable cash flows, and they will give you compounding over time, etc., etc. And I did a whole half an hour program at that time, at the peak of this was September 2020 in CNBC, explaining how these FMCG companies, even if you think that they are steady businesses, have not given steady returns. There have been whole periods when they have given no returns. Hindustan Lever from 1999 to 2010 gave hardly any returns. Bata, which was one of Rakesh's favorites, for 15 years, zero price displacement.
Wow.
So I said but at that time, when talking of FMCG, nobody was talking of ITC and Gillette, because they were not performing well, so they were not even thought of ki FMCG hai bhi. Whereas in early 2021, in our systems, about the first large FMCG company our systems liked was ITC.
Yeah.
And so we got into ITC much before anyone else did. And for 2 years, it was among our top 5 performers. So that's what the machine forces you to do. On the other hand, this was third quarter of 21, so around October 21, a lot of the capital goods and industrial machinery companies started to rank high on our systems. Again, most people started looking at it only in 2023 after they'd gone up 2 to 4 times. But when they started coming up on our system, we also do all the fundamental checks. So we checked that, does the story hold? How does it look? And we said, yes, there's nothing wrong. And actually, and why was nobody else looking at it? Because for 12 years, it had been a dog sector. It was a sector that had given 2% compounding for 12 years from 2009 to 2021. It did nothing. So, no, everyone said, कि ये तो देखना ही नहीं है sector, you know. So, the machine forces you that and the whole point of using a system is that you do not overrule unless you have specific information.
Yeah.
It is called the broken leg analogy, that if a system predicts that someone will go for a concert, the system is going to be right, and you overrule only if you know that somebody has broken their leg and cannot go. So unless you have concrete reasons, you do not overrule.
Got it.
So in this case, we bought, and we, as I said, that sector did extremely well. But most people discovered it 2.5 years later. By which time we were asking every quarter that is the story over.
Yeah.
So that is what the machine forces you to do on both sides.
Interesting. And what about the other side? Let's say something that didn't go your way, right? And what is the learning you saw from that?
See, one thing is that you have to change your definition of mistake. You know, early in your life, you think mistake means that you said a buy and that didn't go up, or you said a sell and the stock went up. But ultimately, you have to know that mistakes are mistakes of process. You have to change your mindset to that. Because and it is a game of probability, which you understood in one theory at that time, but you did not completely understand how to apply it, which is that no matter how well you do your analysis, a certain number of stocks will not do what you expect them to do.
Yeah.
So that's part of the system. That's the way it's supposed to be.
Got it.
In fact, because I said I used to hire freshers, one of the more difficult things to teach freshers is to live with probability and ambiguity. Because all your life you have been in an education system and most of them are engineer MBAs, that where there's one answer to one question. Here you have to work with imperfect information, you have to work with probabilities. So that's the most difficult mind switch to make from an education system. I mean, my degree is also in mathematics, but also in statistics. So I think a little bit of probability I knew. But this is what you have to think about, that how to think of mistakes. But yes, of course, for example, I'll give you before that, I'm talking the 90s when all these Infosys and Wipro and all these companies, IT services companies were, at that time, the normal PE in the Indian market used to be 20-25. These guys had gone up to 60, 70, 80. But, you have to also understand the growth trajectory. And in another context, we had understood the growth trajectory. I remember doing this report on IT services when all these companies had less than 10,000 employees each. And we had done a report that each of these companies will exceed Tisco, which was the highest employer at that time, Tata Steel, which had about 65,000 employees. And we said these guys will go above that. And people said, are you crazy? I mean, these are tiny companies. What are you talking about, that they will become the biggest employers, which they did. So, I mean, we saw that, and yet we could not connect it to the high PE.
Valuations didn't match at that point.
No, I mean, we thought the valuation was too stretched. But if you really believed that growth story, then it was not that high.
Yeah. Wow.
So that
Got
part,
it.
that you in spite of seeing one part, you could not connect it there.
And ma'am, last one thing I want to ask you is, what are some good sectors you're looking at today from India's standpoint? Because we've been changing a lot with the sectors that we have.
See, one of the things which we do is look at everything from base zero every quarter.
Yeah.
Because there is also a very deep-rooted bias called the endowment bias, that we value something more highly simply because we hold it. In fact, the only reason a hold rating exists in the world is endowment bias. Because technically, if you will not buy it today, you should not hold it.
Yeah.
So that's why we look at everything every quarter. So what I tell you is not a 2-year view. I mean, currently from beginning of 24, we've been overweight pharma, healthcare, and auto components particularly, and then later on auto also. This year we have slowly become overweight FMCG.
Okay.
IT will be little over the benchmark weight. Banking, we are always underweight. As I said, I'm a nervous investor in banks, but we have more banks now than we've ever had. So definitely there's been if anything, at least a cyclical upturn in banks.
And ma'am, what is your take on the IPOs that are coming? Because I've seen your posts on LinkedIn and also on the columns, right? What do you think is happening with the IPO market today, and what's going on?
So IPOs, I mean, very simply for the investors, when there is an IPO frenzy, it almost never makes sense to try for that, because most IPOs at that time will be overpriced.
Yeah.
And the few where the business is good and the IPO is priced correctly, you will not get allotment. So either way, there's no point playing this game. And most investors are not even trying to do a valuation and say that is this a good company at a good price. They think it's some kind of lottery.
Yeah.
So, and that always ends badly. The other thought I would like to leave is that how much is the demand for an IPO is no indication of how that stock does eventually. You know, we all know those examples of Reliance Power. And for that matter, in the 90s, there were years when there were 1,200 IPOs and 1,300 IPOs. Most of those companies have disappeared. I mean, even today, only about 4,500 companies trade on the exchanges.
Yeah.
The number of companies listed up until now is at least 3 times that number.
Yeah.
So, you know, 2/3 of the companies have gone.
And you've seen this in the past, like IPO frenzy in
I told you,
1990s,
na?
2000s.
I told you, 1990s, there were 2 years when there were 1,200 IPOs and 1,300 IPOs. And this has been, I mean, the strangest thing in stock markets is that all the patterns emerged as soon as the stock market started from the 17th century onward.
Yeah.
So I was just looking at in 1881, on the Paris Stock Exchange, there were 400 IPOs. I mean, every street vendor, I mean, food vendor was handing out prospectuses. And 1882,
God.
there was a big crash.
Oh my God.
So human nature has not changed in a few thousand years, which is why the biases are so hard-coded.
Yeah.
And on the other side, I mean, they were like, even, I mean, let alone companies which stop trading or go to zero, even DLF, which is had a reasonable business, it never saw its IPO price for decades.
Yeah.
And on the other hand, we mentioned Infosys a while back, which has been one of the big wealth creators in the market. Its IPO was undersubscribed.
Undersubscribed, yeah.
It devolved on the underwriters. It made a lot of money for the underwriters.
Oh my God.
So that's how the market is. So don't play fast and loose with your money, because whenever any bubble bursts, we all look for villains that, you know, company did this and management did this
Yeah.
and the operator did that. But it is also the common speculators' greed that got you to that.
Correct. Awesome. And ma'am, I have one question about your book, right? So you have written a national bestseller book that is Money, Myths and Mantras, right? So according to today's context in the market, what is one myth that you're seeing that's happening today and one mantra that we should follow as retail investors?
Oh, there are many myths, right? From invest in your circle of competence to this buy and hold, which is suffers from survivorship bias, which means that you remember the successes, you forget the failures.
Yeah.
You remember the HDFC Bank and the Kotak Mahindra, you forget the, Times Bank and Global Trust Bank and Yes Bank problem and this and that. So that is one thing. So
Yeah.
there's nothing like buy and forget.
Yeah. And one mantra that I think you're saying that the retail audience should focus on.
Asset allocation and global diversification and risk management, I would say 3.
Asset allocation. Okay.
Yeah.
And ma'am, if I want to ask you very quickly, what does your asset allocation look like today?
So my asset allocation would be about 70-75% would be global, non-India.
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 And global, can you break it up? Is it US only or?
No, it's definitely not US only. In fact, US now we would be underweight. Of course, it's still the highest weight, but like in our global products also. So, this is mostly in our global product, and there the strategy is normally we will have 75-80% in equity, though, at COVID time we went down to less than 10%, but
Okay, wow.
most of the time that's the norm. And the balance is mostly fixed income and a bit of commodities.
Okay. And which markets do you preferably play on the global scale, like US, and then is it China?
We have held South African REITs and Australian mining companies and Chinese shoemakers, everything.
Wow. So Australian mining, I think, you played Australian mining as well? Because I
I'm
came
saying,
to know recently about it.
Currently, we may not be holding. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that that's the range that we look at.
Wow.
So we have been underweight US from the beginning of 2025. We've been overweight Europe. We've been overweight China from 24 itself.
Wow.
So that's some of the big kind of...
Beautiful. Okay, ma'am. So now I'm going to go into like a rapid fire section where I will ask you questions, like quick questions, yeah? And you have to just give me an answer in a minute, okay?
Okay.
First thing, which we just spoke about, do you think buy and hold strategy works and why not?
as I said, this is, if you look at actual, I mean, and people have sent me actual portfolios of their parents, and you look at somebody who hasn't looked at it in 20 years, and you have NEPC Micon and DSQ Software and Penta Media, which were all the 2000 boom companies, or even people can buy the blue chips. But what were the blue chips? Look at the Sensex of the original Sensex. So you have Hindustan Motors, which used to make ambassador cars, Premier Automobiles. You have the groups Mafatlal and Thapars and JK, and you have industries like paper and textile, which were the in industries then, or shipping. And those were all companies, again, with long histories. The original Sensex, every company had a long history, barring Indian hotels. And still, this is, so many of them are not relevant anymore, even if they are still around.
Yeah.
So that's the reality of blue chip. What is a blue chip changes? That if you look at Sensex Nifty composition, at one time there were 0 banks. Now that's the highest weightage. At one time, the whole list was dominated by PSUs. Then came a time people forgot that PSUs are listed. So your mind is very attuned towards going on just now and what is the current thing. So this definitely doesn't.
That definitely doesn't work. Okay. Should Indian investors invest globally?
Absolutely. I mean, in fact, that's, I think, the biggest gap for Indian investors, that they have 90-100% of their investments in India. Objectively, the number should be higher, but at least get to 30-40% of your portfolio. And global doesn't mean the US. And because it's a cause for me, we have all geographies, all asset product that starts at $10,000. So less than 9 lakh rupees currently. So.
Wow. Okay.
And the rupee depreciates. I mean, when I started working, the dollar was 12 rupees.
Wow.
So when you're talking long-term financial goals, which are 10, 20, 30 years ago, later, you cannot forget this.
Interesting. And do you invest in IPOs? And if yes, what was the last IPO you remember you invested in?
No, I have not for a very, very long time. And I think after the 90s, probably not. Because as I said, you're most of the time the allotment is also so much of a question mark. But remember, there is no two different ways to value an IPO company versus a listed company. There's only one way to value a company.
Oh, wow. Superb. One question. When there was a 2008 crash, what was one core memory that was etched into you at that point? Because you've seen everything. So what was that one memory that you're like, oh, wo time pe ye hua tha types?
No, it was a shock at that time. But it actually, at least for India, the upturn also came very fast. So we made a call in 2000, I think first quarter or so, on when the bad times were over for now, at least. And so also actually the COVID crash. So I tweeted on March 2 that something very crazy is happening, because at that time Japan and Italy had shut down schools. And first time you saw these tourist attractions of Rome with nobody around. Later on we got used to those images, but that was the first time. And I said, this is unprecedented, truly unprecedented, because even during the World Wars, nothing like this happened. And we went totally risk averse. As I said, in our global products, we went from 75-80% equity to less than 10% equity.
Yeah.
And that saved us. But within 3 weeks, again, this is a public tweet. We tweeted time to be back. Because if you had missed that, because we saw that such a sharp fall will always see a reaction. We did not see, we were not sure how long that would last, but we could see that there would be a very sharp uptake, which happened. So by the end of March, we were again fully invested.
Superb. Okay. And last question. One thing about Mr. Rakesh Jhunjhunwala sir that ordinary investors today should follow or should look up to.
So he knew that the market returns are lumpy. So I say his superpower was not identifying stocks. It was to know that the market returns are very lumpy. I mean, there's a book on him, and I think the one line that stood out for me was that he said, I made a lot of money in 89 to 92, in that 2000 to 2007 period that I spoke about. And I think 2000, around 2011, was 3 periods he had given. And he said, in between, there were even 5 years when I made no money.
Wow.
So to understand that in equity markets, 10-year returns can come in 2 years, and every Every 5 years, the returns can be completely different. That discipline is the key thing, key learning from him.
Interesting. Because like when you said something like,
I mean, he did not know he would make all his money in Crisil, Titan, and Lupin. That was not the thing. Every time I used to meet him, he used to talk about different stocks. So-
no, but that, as you said, right, you never know in the future what's going to
Yes,
happen.
exactly.
Yeah. But I think one thing that you mentioned, that there was a period where 8-9 years there was no returns in the Indian market, and then in 2 years 6 times up, right?
Yeah.
In today's market, I feel most retailers are like 12% to aana chahiye har saal, right? And this last
That is what I'm saying. That was Rakesh's superpower, to know ki in equity market there could be 5 years when you get no return, and then you will make out like a bandit.
Yeah. So he knew when to sit quiet and he knew when to play aggressive.
Yeah, or at least, I mean, in India, this is SEBI data that more than half the mutual fund investors do not even remain invested for 2 years.
Correct.
And so all these 20-year and 30-year return and compounding you see is only in theory for most people. And you sit out the wrong times. I mean, this is the other data. From the time Sensex started, which is 40 odd years, suppose you miss out on the 10 best days. You would say in 40 years, 10 din kya hote hain? But if you miss out on the 10 best days, you miss out on 2/3 of the return.
Wow.
So your 100 rupees, instead of, let us say, becoming 85,000, will be only 24,000.
Correct.
Or 28,000. So, and if you miss out on the 30 best days, which is not even 1 day a year, you miss out on 90% of the returns. And these good days do not come in bull markets. The bull markets, normally the market doesn't move so rapidly. So these always come when people are down in the dumps, when they are asking SIP band kar dein, should I sit out? Should I not invest anymore? Or should I book whatever I have and move it elsewhere? Maybe to gold, maybe now to global, because last 1 year I have not got return. So this is all sentiment is a contraindicator. So this, again, all research studies across the world have shown. In multiple countries, it's the same story. Then when people are extremely buoyant, as they were, let us say, middle of 2024, the next period returns are below normal. When people are questioning, fearful, anxious, the next period returns are above normal. That's the rule. I mean, last year people were telling me, and this I'm talking large investors, even family offices, telling me, no, I'm not unrealistic. I'll be happy with a 30-35% compounding. I said, that is unrealistic. Because at that time it appeared so easy.
Yeah. Wow. But I love that one statement that you said, sentiment is a contraindicator, right?
That's a research study.
That's super. Yeah. But again, I think, thank you, ma'am, for this, because I think the amount of knowledge that you've given on this podcast is superb. And it's also a big eye-opener for a lot of retail investors who are watching this, because as you said, most of us have come from the COVID boom era, right? And we've seen that knee-jerk reaction. And then we've only seen good for 3-4 years. I think first time we have seen 1 year of no returns, and people, half of them have lost their mind also, that kuch aaya nahi, gold has given better, fixed deposits are back in fashion.
So I mean, like when my book came out end of January. So in February, I had done a number of podcasts, and all of them I'm saying the same thing, that if you were waiting for a correction to invest, have you invested?
Yeah.
At February, we ended at 22,100.
Yeah.
So it has up from there.
Yeah. Well, that's there. I think in the market, buy high, sell low is the mantra, not the opposite. But again, thank you, ma'am. Thanks a lot for this knowledge. And, because the audience also seeks a lot of knowledge from, investors like you. So again, you've seen that, you've seen the experience. So it was an honor for me also to come and sit here and learn from you. So thanks again, ma'am, for this.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.